Good morning, this is David Goodell with SBM support. Today we're going to talk about SBM and setting up SAML2. So what is SAML2? SAML2 is the way we communicate with an identity provider to ensure authentication to your software. So why would we want to use SAML2? Well, for starters, there's two reasons. We've got a single sign-on. Pretty much you log into every other application using a particular identity provider, say Okta or ADFS, and you want that login experience to be the same across the board. The other reason would be you want to implement a multi-factor authentication with SBM. So you want to have the user provide their username and password and then get prompted with a text where they enter an additional code. That's going to be done through this third-party identity provider. So we're going to jump into the setup now. Our setup is going to use Okta, is the way we're going to demonstrate this. And let's move on from there. Okay, so here is our SBM configurator. Many of you already know this. In here, we want to first take a look at our configuration, our component servers, because the component servers is what controls the URLs that SBM sees underneath the hood. It's the way XML files get set up and whatnot. So if we click on the component servers here, you'll notice here we have a host name. Okay, and we're using port 80 and 443, and all components are, all access to all components are happening through IIS, i.e. use IIS to proxy all server requests. That means Tomcat services such as mail services, repository, orchestration engine, single sign-on, and common services are all going to be accessed via port 443. So we're going to go over here to take a look at what this means from URL perspective. Let's click on security. And then on our secure SSO tab, we'll notice these URLs here. So the application engine is located at this server name, federation server at this server name, token service, and token service external. So let's go ahead and move on to the next step here. Let's say we had our single sign-on server on this other server here. Say we were also going to put our orchestration engine over there and our mail services. Okay, so we pretty much now have a distributed environment here. Let me go ahead and give this server a name. Okay, so its name is SSO server, serena.com. We'll give it a port to work on. Let's just say it's 443. Okay, that's just the port that its Tomcat would be listening on. And now let's take a look at what security has to say. Okay. So again, you'll notice now our security token service is using SSO server for both external and internal, and then you have your federation server. Okay, let's make another quick change here. Okay, so let's say we go on a more typical port for a Tomcat server, and let's do 8443. And we can go click on security. And now you'll notice those port numbers here will go to 8443. Our application engine, of course, is still on the original server. Okay, so now, depending on what your setup is, it's going to depend on how we define those four URLs. And the definition of those URLs will be necessary to provide Okta or your other IDP the appropriate URLs. So for now, I'm going to go and move this back over to here to keep things a little bit simpler. Okay, now the one other thing I want to show you is this Beyond Firewall. Now, Beyond Firewall isn't like you have some magical hardware in place. It just means how does the user access SBM? So maybe the user accesses it by going to team track, to use an older name. Okay, and you're going to use 443. Okay, so now as we do that, when we take a look at our URLs are going to reflect that users access via team track name, and internally we're going to access on port 80. So let's see how that works. Okay, so our application engine web services, so that's going to be an internal. Notice how it's HTTP, so it's all port 80. Our federation server is going to team track 443. And then our external is going to team track SSL 443. And our internal is using our internal server name on port 80 because it's HTTP. Okay, so for now, we're going to go ahead and uncheck the Beyond Firewall and go with our current setup. Now let's move over to authentication. Okay. Our browser, on our general tab here, browser sessions are single sign-on. Browser authentication is third-party authentication system. And then web services, to access our web services, will be the internal database. Over here, it could either say third-party service provider, or in this case, we want to use SAML2 specifically. So we check the SAML2. Okay, in most cases, in almost all cases, you're going to use HTTPS for endpoints. Force authentication can be used. It's a way to override things. Typically, you're not going to ever want to use that. And then with maximum authentication age, that pretty much controls how old a particular token from Okta could get. So whatever that is, typically it's 7,200, but whatever that is, we want to make sure that matches, that SBM doesn't have a number of 7,200, but Okta is 9,600. I think in some cases, ADFS will have an authentication age of 90 days. Well, we better, in that case, make our maximum authentication age here closer to 90 days. So for now, we're going to leave with that. And now we take a look at our service provider. Click on our view metadata. Now in this, there's a couple of important things. The most important thing here is our entity identity. This is how Okta or our IDP is going to identify who we are. Okay, so notice how it puts in just the fully qualified domain name that was in host name. Typically, that's going to be, if I start playing around with Beyond Firewall, it's going to be my Beyond Firewall name or something like that. Typically, that's how Okta is going to be able to identify it. Okay, and we'll look at that a little bit further later on. Now, down here, our important URLs are going to be these assertion consumer services and the HTTP post, which is the most useful. And notice how it goes to our server name, IDP, SAML, SSL. That's the gist of what our provider is. So let's go ahead and see how that is set up in Okta. Well, one other thing before we do that, notice we have a certificate. This controls how SBM signs its requests. Typically, it's good to just do a generate. You don't need a specific certificate authority. Just let SBM handle it, and you're done. Okay, now let's move over to Okta here. Okay, so here is our Okta, our administration portal. We're going to take a look at an application. We're going to start, we'll take a look at this SBM IDP. Okay, on our general tab. That's just the standard label. And then we have these SAML settings. Things like that single sign-on URL, pretty much those assertion URLs we saw. Notice how they're all referencing our host name. Okay, and then audience restriction, we'll see more about that and how that works. Let's go ahead and click Edit. Okay, this is straightforward. I'll just, any name that we provide. Our single sign-on, we made sure it matches our name, and then it was pointing to IDP SAML SSO. The audience URI, see how it has SPM entity ID? Remember how we saw that back here? Let's move back to SBM. And view metadata. And then that's that entity ID right there. So let's go ahead and switch back to Okta now. Okay, so that's the standards, our application username. That's pretty much what Okta is going to send to us, a username, prefix, and email custom. We're just going to go with a standard Okta username. And then we're going to go ahead and hit next. And I'm an Okta customer at an internal app. And then go ahead and hit finish. Okay. So the bulk of that set up. Now we have this SAML 2.0 sign-on method, and we need this metadata URL here. If we go ahead and copy that, and let's switch over to SBM now. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that out. We're going to click on our metadata. We're going to tell it to import from URL, and we're going to paste our Okta URL, tell it to import. You also choose a file. Let's just tell it to reindent and validate. XML is valid. Notice now how we have that HTTP post. That's how what Okta has configured. And that's the place that we're going to get redirected to do our authentication. Okay. So let's go ahead and click OK to that. And now we are at this point all set up. Let's go just double check our URLs one more time. Now again, the federation server and such is all pointing to the names that we expect. So let's go ahead and apply that and say yes. Okay, so SBM is done doing its configuration. So we're going to move over to our browser and take a look at our SBM. We're going to click this login, tell it to start doing the login. And we'll see it's browsing, and let's let SBM come up here, and we'll start the login process. So what you've seen here is we've gone through the steps to set up SBM to work with a SAML2 and demonstrated some of the details of settings that can be set within the configurator. Now, one last thing is if we move over here, you'll see our practitioner portal. Notice that we're at docs.microfocus.com, Solutions Business Manager 12.1. You'll see this authentication, about third-party authentication, and configuring the identity provider settings. You'll see how it talks about SAML2. This is a good explanation for each of the values, what they are. There is your maximum authentication age. And it's a very good resource for getting this set up. With that, I'll leave you to have a good day and talk to you soon.